Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, founder and chief executive of Aurora. My guest on the show today is the head of power project finance in Brazil for Santander. And Santander, as I imagine all listeners will know, is one of the largest and most influential lenders globally in the renewable space. But in this role, my guest is responsible for providing perhaps the largest volume of non-state-backed debt into Brazil's power sector. My guest on the show is Igor Fonseca. Welcome, Igor.
Hi, John. Thanks for inviting me for this interesting podcast. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I hope I can share some insights on the Brazilian market.
Great. No, I'm really excited about the conversation. When it comes to debt and lending in Brazil, you are the guy. So fantastic that you could carve time out of your busy schedule to speak with us. So can I just start as background for listeners? What does Santander, the bank, do in Brazil? There's a renewables piece, but what is the scope of operations?
Great. So Santander, as of now, is the largest international financial institution in the country. Actually, many of other foreign banks that invest in the country, they have relatively small operations, pretty much on corporate investment banking, but Santander actually has a very large retail operation in the country. We are the third largest private bank in the country, and we have been here for many years. Santander has been very active on buying banks throughout the last decades. So we ultimately merged those big banks in Brazil that formed what Santander is today. So we have around 35 million customers, and we represent about 30% of Santander's global results. It's something interesting, but as of recent years, Santander has been more relevant in Brazil than in Spain. So Brazil is a big portion of everything the bank does. And obviously, it's very also connected with our overall renewable strategy.
Yeah. Well, I'd be pretty confident you don't have 35 million clients in Spain. You'd be in a very strong market position there. And then just drilling into the project finance function. So obviously you're doing a lot in energy, but there's broader lending as well. How do you spend your time between different asset classes?
Great. So we have a team in Brazil with different sector coverages. I'm the one responsible for the power sector as a whole. So I'm either responsible for renewable energy, wind, solar, which is pretty much some 70% of our pipeline. But I'm still looking at some conventional renewable electricity, such as hydropower plants. We still have some in Brazil, some new small ones, new built, a lot of brownfield assets, given our strong hydro matrix, and also some combined and simple cycle gas-fired thermal power plants. So regardless of the sector, whatever is power generation sits beneath my responsibility. And just as a quick comment, other sectors that are booming in infrastructure in Brazil as a whole, water and sewage is going a huge investment. We still are lacking a lot of simple things as getting a water and sewage treatment to people's houses. And there was big reforms some 4 or 5 years ago, and now the private sector is overtaking the water and sanitation. So there's a lot of things going on. And also on logistics, we still have a lot of investments in toll roads, airports, ports, and railroads. So the whole infrastructure sector is quite big, but still energy from our own business, represents about more than a half, 55% of everything Santander as a project finance bank does in Brazil. So renewable energy is still our most important business here.
Yeah, interesting. And it is, the European perspective is, I suspect, the focus on renewables just because of the direction of capital, and some of those historical investments around other infrastructure that have been made is more skewed towards renewables. It's you have to remember in these rapidly growing sort of middle income countries, the level of expenditure on infrastructure that is going on. Can I ask? So Santander, it looks to me at least as though it's been hugely successful in Brazil, and it's been a theme of recent podcasts on, I suppose, the victors write the history, and so we've had, they're the ones we're interviewing are the ones that won in a sense. There aren't, there's no foreign bank on the podcast that failed in Brazil, but we had AES who has done, and Rogério was on recently who did very well. We had Luis Pitta who's had a career in Brazil and Atlas and succeeding there. So a theme has been, what has it taken to be successful in Brazil? Do you have reflections on sort of what has enabled Santander's success in the Brazilian market where others have failed?
Yeah, I think the first main reason, and this is a bit old story from other markets and other situations, but it's about being the first mover. Sometimes it ends up paying off. Just for you to have an idea, the team that I'm responsible currently has been set up locally in São Paulo, Brazil, around 21 years ago, in 2002, right? At that point in time, honestly, there was no other local bank, Brazilian bank, and neither international bank that was setting up a project financing shop here locally, right? So by doing that, we ended up positioning ourselves in a very good way to serve all the different waves of investments in the power sector that Brazil has had, right? Obviously, they state-owned banks, they're very relevant, and we're going to talk maybe this later in our podcast. But those banks, they don't take all the risk. They need private capital, and Santander was there from the beginning. So just to give one example, the first ever wind project built and financed in Brazil, it's called Ventos do Sul, is in the south of Brazil, and it was built by the Spanish company Elecnor Energy, which is their renewable arm. And that project was financed in 2005, if I'm not mistaken. Back then, obviously, Santander was already financing wind assets in Spain, a couple ones in the UK, Germany, and other countries that we were present. And we were here when it all began in 2005 in Brazil. And this was a reality for solar, for biomass, and for other type of energy assets that were built. So by being a first mover, it actually made us get a very leadership position, right? Over the last years, we've managed to keep ourselves in the number one league tables. It's hard to do so because when you're in that position for such a long time, I can be honest to you that many of our competitors all the time are trying to get our position back. Not only other international banks, but we also have a very big private banks in Brazil, right? But I would say among all different influence, first one would be being the first mover. The second one is by being an international bank, most of our clients are international investors. I would say that some 60% of them are European-based companies, some 20% are American, and another 20% are Asian clients, especially Chinese and Japanese, right? So given this background, many of the clients, when they decide to invest in Brazil and they're looking at some expertise from someone to help them, they probably are already clients of Santander as a big global institution in any geographies, right? So it's sometimes for us, we are in a peculiar situation that sometimes we have to deny clients, right? We get so many calls and we have to pick the one that we're going to be able to support. But obviously, we're very happy by having this big inflow of investments and clients that end up being calling to our desks. So those are perhaps the two main reasons.
Yeah, not a bad position to be in. Maybe you need to increase your lending margins or something. It's let price dictate the quantity.
Yeah.
Just one theme that came up was sort of the long-term perspective. I mean, is it a country where Santander over the years have seen ups and downs and sort of has had greater tolerance for the long-term vision? Or has that played a role, would you say, or second, lower tier?
No, it's very important. To be honest, we have had many problems. There were years that we had relevant losses to our portfolio by projects or companies that were simply not performing. And in the last 20 years, we have had a different crisis. Some of them are more in the macro environment, right? By being a country still under development, we have volatile interest rates, volatile FX, volatile inflation, right? So you have to deal with that. And sometimes those macro points, they impact the micro transactions that you're doing. But there's also some sector-specific discussions, potentially some changes in regulation, some new risk factors that were not initially perceived. So throughout this period, I would highlight, for example, one in the power sector, which is the hydrological risk. If you really ask us and any other investor 20 years ago, no one was really perceiving that as a risk in Brazil. But ultimately, our hydropower plants are not performing as people thought they would be 20 years ago, right? So I really take some time and belief as an international investor. In our case, we're a bank, but I think will be the same for a sponsor, that you can trust the institutions, right? So although there is maybe some short-term volatility, small changes in regulation, changes in tax, interest rates, inflation, if you really believe that the institutions behind the whole framework are solid, and independent, you really see that those issues in the short term are all going to be overcome. So that's basically what has been our story here.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, and I spend a reasonable amount of time globally with people who are leading the various institutions, system operators, regulators, government departments. I mean, these are, my impression is it's an incredibly competent set of organizations around Enel, around the system operator and the leadership there, the government. It's not surprising what you're saying based on my personal experience. Can I dig into the power sector a bit more now? So we've talked about Santander and long-term success, and maybe pick up on one of the themes you mentioned before, which is the dominance or the influential role of state banks in Brazil. BNDES is sort of monolithic in the power sector. Why does state lending play such a disproportionate role in Brazil? Brazil's not alone. The Philippines is a bit like this. India isn't to an extent. What explains the dominance of state-backed lenders?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the past, but I'll also comment on the outlook, right? Because things are changing. But basically, if you look on the last 20 or 30 years, Brazil's overnight interest rate has been quite high. If you would look on an average for the last 3 decades, I would get the average is like 15 to 20% per annum. Overnight interest rates. It's super, super high, right? Obviously, in more recent years, it has been closer to 10%, sometimes a little bit lower than 10, sometimes a little bit higher, but are around 10%. But 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it was even higher, right? And then at that point in time, to bring infrastructure investments while doing inflation control in terms of the central bank, it was really challenging, because if our interest rate was going to be 20-30% per annum, as the overnight rate was, for anyone to invest in a long-term project, it would simply not be economically feasible, right? So at that point in time, it was important for the country to create this strong state-owned entity, especially BNDES, right, that had access to subsidized interest rates. So although the overnight rates, for example, 30 years ago, they were like 25% per annum, BNDES could lend money to an infrastructure project at 10% interest rate. So a significant subsidy, right? And it has obviously changed throughout the years. But by having access to that subsidy in interest rates, it was a very important tool to make private investments in the power sector specifically being backed by a significant portion of the debt, which had some subsidy behind. It wasn't just a different way for the government to subsidize investments. It could be tax reliefs, it could be regulatory charges, it could be anything else, but ultimately it was just interest rates. So the national treasury was funding this difference so that BNDES balance sheet could hold on putting this lower interest for the clients. So by doing that throughout the years, it ended up creating something that ultimately was not good. It was kind of a monopoly, right? Well, given that they have such a big subsidy, they're everyone is going to get the money from them, and they can actually play the rules that they want to play, right? It was, and this monopoly was not good for the whole financial markets in Brazil. But this, in more recent years, John, it has changed, because back on 2017, there was a law enacted that basically ended this big subsidy that was on interest rates and created a transition period of 5 years, starting on 2018. And actually, in 2023 was the last year of this transition period. And this transition period was basically a movement from BNDES big subsidies to market rates. So starting from this year, BNDES, whatever they offer, the base rate is the same as the private sector could offer. So that big subsidy is out of the table. And this has been very, very good for the development of the local debt capital markets and private funding, because without such big monopoly on interest rates, new pockets of sources and money came to offer important tool for the investors building their own projects. So as of now, right, BNDES cannot offer a lower interest rates, but what they still can offer, and that remains a very important relevance of what they do, is tenor. They can obviously go to very, very long tenor, and not always the private sector can go so long. So they're still a relevant, very, very relevant player, but not as a monopoly as they used to be in the past, right? So, yeah. So the dominance is basically explained by that. But it's interesting to know, John, that although BNDES was responsible for 80% of power financing over the last 2 decades, I would say, they are not necessarily taking the risk. So Brazil has a very peculiar market, and this has very few precedents in other geographies, on which, although the state-owned bank lends the money to projects and they go very long tenor, I'm talking about 20, 24, 25-year facilities, typically they don't like to take construction and completion risks. So although they offer the financing, someone else has to take the risk, and that's typically a private bank. It could also be a corporate balance sheet for a very strong utility. And if it's not a very strong utility, they have basically to find a bank who take that risk and post guarantees in the benefit of the state-owned lenders, BNDES in this case. So although you look on the figures, again, 80% of everything was financed by BNDES itself, the risk that they were taking was very small. At the end of the day, they had other institutions sharing and taking part of the risk.
Got it. But they would take the market risk. So once the asset exists, they would offer a long tenor and take the price risk on the asset.
Okay. Yes.
That's really fascinating in general on how that works, and particularly in the context of high inflation. I've often said I do think in most markets there is actually a really important role for the state lender. We had the Green Investment Bank in the UK. Australia has a couple of state banks, essentially state-funded institutions that support projects. And to some extent, it's the way I think about it, I'm a little bit cynical, but it's sort of politicians are going to want to cut ribbons and build things. And so if you can put some financial discipline between the pet project of the politician and the decision to lend against it, you can get slightly better outcomes. And I don't blame politicians for that, but if you can sort of, someone wants to build a biomass plant in a particular electorate, if you can have a bit of financial discipline and process, I think that's an important role that these institutions can play, because politicians are going to build it one way or the other if they want to an extent. Okay, so it sounds like you think it's going to change. There's going to be a lot more foreign debt. Could I ask, one of the or sort of private sector debt, I should say, one of the biggest changes coming up in Brazil at the moment is the ability that what many in Brazil would call the movement to the free market, which is the ability for at least high voltage consumers to bilaterally sell their power and not sell it into a pool. Do you see this impacting your role as well? So there's tailwinds from the BNDES no longer subsidizing interest rates. How do you see the movement to the free market, all these bilateral PPAs impacting your role in the sector, Igor?
it has a big impact, So putting it under perspective, I'll focus this comment on renewable energy, solar and wind, which is pretty much everything going on. If you look until 2017 and 18, everything that Brazil was building till that period was pretty much based on regulated PPAs by federal auctions organized by the regulatory agency under 20-year plus PPAs with utility companies, all under the regulated regime. It was until 2017 and 18. But it got to a point that the renewable electricity was so competitive, so low, that big electricity consumers that were already able back then in 2018 to purchase electricity in a bilateral PPA, they never had interest on going to longer term tenor PPA. When the price of renewable energy was so low, right, they started seeing this as an opportunity not only to help their energy transition targets, but also to secure very good prices. So starting on 18, 19, 20, and then it has boom on 21 and 22, a lot of bilateral corporate PPAs have been signed in moments where renewable electricity was very, very low prices, right? More recently, by what you brought, right? Now we're having the opening of the full market, right? All high voltage consumers will be able to do the same things that 5 years ago it was only blue chip companies, right? It was like Vale, the mining company, the petrochemical companies, all those big electricity consumer companies. They were already doing that, but that market it was not allowed for smaller companies. Now, with the opening of the free market, this is going to be really a new reality for sponsors and lenders to find their strategies into, because it is moving to a more retail market, but outside of the regulated market. When we were in regulated tariffs, although there was a retail component, it was easy to take, right? When we go to unregulated markets with retail components, the risk profile is going to be very different. So we're talking about companies that don't consume 100 megawatts, but actually consume 1 megawatt, 0.5 megawatts, 0.2 megawatt of load, right? Which means that for a project to be feasible, they're probably going to have dozens, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of PPAs with different smaller consumers, right? And those consumers won't necessarily sign 20-year contracts. They may sign 5, 3, 4, 7-year-long PPAs. And basically, the route to market strategy that the sponsors are going to take of how to achieve to those smaller consumers is going to be playing a big, big role into the financing of those, So one example, those big utility companies in Brazil that already operates under the regulated market, or they already have big trading operations, they can, if they want to, and most of them do want, they can take part of that retail risk, put under their trading arms, and then wrap it up when they secure the electricity from renewable projects by signing an intercompany PPA backed there by a very good company behind, right? But other companies, financial sponsors, developers, they don't necessarily access to that same strategy, and they will have to go directly to those end consumers using a retailer or something in as intermediary vehicle, which is going to increase the challenging for us to have comfort on the future predictability of the cash flows that are going to be generated. So it's going to be a very new reality for us. This is a process that maybe other geographies has already undertaken years ago, right? But it's something very new to us.
Yeah, and it does start to feel a bit like, the role of the retail utility in liquidity transformation, right? So there's a project that wants a long-term PPA. There's a customer that doesn't want to sign for more than 2 years, and whose job is it to? And this guy, the guy who wants the long-term PPA is big, 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts. The guy who wants the 2-year is 0.2 or 0.5 megawatts peak or whatever it is, and someone has to perform that liquidity transformation. And then I think there's a question as to how that plays out. Sometimes vertical integration is the dominant strategy, and the guy doesn't just do the liquidity transformation. He owns the assets upstream, and he's got the customer book. And sometimes that's not how it plays out. And there are different patterns I think you see around the world. But we're certainly watching it very closely, and certainly it seems like there's a much bigger role for the private sector here in managing some of these risks. Can you just say a little bit? You've got there's a larger number of people who are now participating in the energy market. Sort of sub megawatt demand. Capacity demand levels. How do they think about greenness? So if I'm a McDonald's or an Amazon or whoever it is there in what ways would that organization, or in what ways are you seeing that organization would reflect any preference for green power than gray power?
Well, those guys are paying a premium for green power, but I would say that most of that premium is explained by regulation than necessarily strategy. Obviously, people are not going to sign a long-term PPA from a brown asset at all, right? But if they're really looking on buying a renewable electricity origin certification, in Brazil, they ended by what we call the incentivized energy. And this incentivized energy basically allows the consumer to have a discount on their on-grid fee charges, right? So if I am a consumer and I buy electricity directly from a solar project, I can have a 50% discount in my grid connection charges. And if I don't, I'm going to pay the full grid fee as a consumer. So at the end of the day, I'm willing to pay a little bit more for the renewable project than I would for any brown assets, So, and this is only for wind, solar, biomass, and small hydro. So for example, even if someone wanted to buy, for example, electricity from a very old hydropower plant, very big ones, which is the most majority of our electricity matrix as of now, they're not going to get that discount. This was part of the indirect subsidies that Brazil created, to help the renewable energy sector to growth. But as of now, this incentive, this specific subsidy is getting so big that is getting relevant, and the amount of money that has to be paid for someone to make that incentive happening is getting very big. So this is changing also, and the latest regulation, people are not going to be able to do that anymore for future projects, right? So now the question will be, okay, without this specific regulation, are people still going to pay a premium for green assets? Let's see.
Yeah. And in a market that is 50+% green already, you're not displacing a lot of carbon when you build. You're not displacing as much carbon if you build a solar farm or wind farm as you might in a different market as well. Okay, great. So that's the move to the free market, and that's really interesting, and I think hugely exciting what that does to the market structure in Brazil. The other big policy, and I confess, I don't really understand the concretely what's happening, but is the green transition plan. Big announcements. President Lula's big policy of for energy and industrialization. How do you see that impacting the power investment sector in Brazil?
Well, people are both anxious and optimistic of what is about to come, because if you look on the last 5 years, actually, we already had a big boom of investments, right? And actually, we're in a moment, and you guys are very aware of that, of a kind of an oversupply situation, right? We have built a lot of renewable assets, both centralized, utility scale, also distributed generation. And the country hasn't grown that much, although load is growing, it hasn't grown as people maybe thought 5, 6, 7 years ago. And now we have this oversupply situation. So for a new power investment in the country, what the sponsors and the investors are looking is how they can develop new clients, right? New needs, new demand that has to be addressed somehow. And from the government point of view, the policy is that they're trying to take advantage of this in one hand to help under a new industrialization of the country. That's what they're calling, right? From over the last 2 decades, Brazil relevance as industry under our GDP has decreased a lot. We are becoming more and more a commodities kind of a country, either on agribusiness and mining and oil, right? And the government obviously wants to the economy to be more value accretive, value added. by taking advantage of low energy prices to bring more industrial facilities into the country as a whole. And in addition to that, there is one specific point, which is the whole hydrogen economy, right? That could fit very well under this strategy, which is something that the government is looking to promote. So either bringing traditional industries, making more investments in Brazil, and new industries such as hydrogen. This is what people are expecting to create this additional demand for new power investments.
Yeah. Yeah, when you talk about sort of optimism and anxiety, it sounds a bit like, I mean, there's been a few of these big bang policies lately. The most recent one was Australia, and I think the industry where government said, "Hey, we're going to support 32 gigawatts of new capacity and a 40 gigawatt peak system," and investors said that, it's great that you're taking renewables seriously, but this is potentially quite a big risk to things I've already built. And so can I please understand a bit more of the detail? Whereas I think the Inflation Reduction Act, at least from the generation sector in the US, it was a little bit, there was a big private sector role, and there was sort of clarity around how this would fit together with the power sector. I think there was a lot more enthusiasm for that policy. So the details matter, definitely. And certainly, there is a risk that if you announce something without providing some of the details, people get nervous as well. I've seen that one before. Good. So one of the other topics, and I probably hear about this less in Brazil than in other markets, is the topic of network build. You hear about a lot of the early projects in renewables were in the Northeast, where land is a bit cheaper, where some of the weather patterns were better, but a little away from demand centers. And that works up to a point, but you start to get congestion in the grid, you start to get curtailment. Now, I know ANEEL, the regulators, had announced sort of transmission auctions. They had one in June. There's another one coming up soon. How do you feel, and to me, this sort of the grid risk kind of takes people by surprise. Sometimes it's not there until it is there to an extent. How do you as a lender feel about grid risk in Brazil, maybe in contrast to some of Santander's other markets? Do you see it as a problem? Are we building enough grid, or do we need to increase the speed?
We do see this as a problem increasingly, right? If you asked me this question 5-7 years ago, my answer would be a blunt no. Now, actually, I'm a little bit concerned, but I still think, maybe I'm a little biased, I admit, because I'm Brazilian, but I still think, our transmission planning system is one of the best in the world. Just to give you one example, as you mentioned, in June, we had an auction for $3 billion capex. Now in December, in 2 weeks from now, we're going to have an auction for $5 billion capex. On March, there is another auction for another $3.5 billion.
These are US dollars, I imagine.
US dollars are already putting in dollars. So I'm talking about a $10 billion of new investments that are going to undertake the next 3 to 5 years, right, to build this new additional capacity. And if you look at on the previous years, although none of them was as large as this one I'm mentioning, we always have had a significant amount of investments being auctioned, and given the risk matrix that was created for the transmission players to invest, it's very easy to bring companies to invest. So basically, the government organizes the initial planning. They look on what is the line going to come from, the initial environmental licensing, the feasibility, and then they say, okay, if you want to build this asset, the reference capex is, let's say, $5 billion. If you have savings, that's going to be on your return. And if you win that auction, you have the obligation to build the line in 5 years. And after that, you have a fixed revenues for 30 years, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very low risk investment if you can overcome the construction cost.
Yeah.
So by doing that, we have expanded our grid relatively well. That does not mean that we don't have problems. Given that we have this change in regulation, there was this gold rush, right? People trying to run to build as much renewable capacity in the old rules. And that has created more congestion, right? But not because our grid was not good, but just because people were really trying to take advantage of changes in regulation. And there was like 200 gigawatts of projects that were protocol that obviously would never be built, that we don't have even power needs for that much, So assuming that we have to continue to expand our network in reasonable amounts, I think we're going to be able to do that. The only big question that I still have is if this demand supply will have specific moments of imbalance, right? But as a overall trend, I see as doing well, this expansion.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, it tends to be. And so does that mean that from a public acceptance perspective, once it's, some in the UK, people don't like high voltage lines above their heads. Once it's in the auction, there's not really any public acceptance risk.
It's really complex for that to be the. Sometimes for environmental licensing, it may be needed to change a little bit, the original design. But in terms of land, there is a law in Brazil that says, out of public interest, if it is defined that a transmission line is going to be built, you have to accept that. Obviously, you're going to get compensated for that, but it's really, really hard that not to be built. And from an environmental perspective, there were cases, for example, that originally it was designed that transmission line will, for example, go through an indigenous area, right, of indigenous people, native vegetation. Obviously, the environmental license wouldn't approve that to happen, and then probably they needed to redesign the route that was being taken, But overall, I would say that maybe because we're still country under development, right, and people understand that we really need more power, there hasn't been a big scrutiny, from the society against those grid reinforcements.
Interesting. It is. That's a really positive message, and you talked about compensating, the people who are near. It's the nature of these projects that the beneficiaries are a lot more broadly distributed. That's the whole population. Than the potential losers who are people who are under the lines, and so it is I think most European countries are still grappling with this idea of, okay, this is good for society in some cases, but the losers are louder and more concentrated than the winners. So how do we get everyone on board? If there was one innovation in the energy transition over the next 5 years in Europe that I wanted to see, I think that would probably be it. Okay. And you touched on the gold rush, and in particular around solar, right? And it's pretty wild. It's one of these examples of a cutoff date on a policy, and suddenly just gigawatts of projects turn up before the closing date. Now, Brazil has been dominated from a solar perspective, at least, by distributed solar compared to the transmission connected solar. Is this why is this happening? And is it a good thing, or is it a sign of market dysfunction that we're getting the smaller stuff and not the bigger stuff?
Look, John, at the beginning, this was a good thing, but it has already been some time that this is for me is a market disruption somehow, right? This regulation that we have for net metering for distributed generation was created in 2012. And without that, we'll never had solar investments, But it is already for some 3 or 4 years, right? That incentive that is a little bit indirect, it's not necessarily important for new solar investments to be done, but that was still the rule of the game, right? And people were taking advantage of that rule. So basically, for a distributed generation asset you build in Brazil, under that rule that changed now, you could get 100% compensation of energy produced and consumed as long as in the same region of the utility that you are connected, right? It doesn't even have to be rooftop. Obviously, a big portion of it is rooftop, but there's still a lot of small solar farms that are built to supply consumers in the same region of the utility company. And given this full compensation, basically people are using the grid because obviously during night there is no sun, no one has batteries, right? But they're not paying anything for the grid, like paying for zero, right? And that's a little bit exaggerated, but actually what that made is that those investments were and still are very profitable from the investor point of view. They can get very good returns by building, either purchasing and putting panels on their own rooftops, or even building small solar farms to lease those farms to someone, right? But the government already realized it a few years ago that it was too much and needed to be changed. But obviously, there's a lot of lobbies and different interests in this market. It has become such a big market, and there's a lot of companies that basically all they do is this distributed solar business. And after a lot of fight in Congress, we ended having a new law in 2022, at the end of 21, beginning of 22, which basically created this transition period also for distributed energy. So looking forward, right, it should still be an appealing investment, but not overly exaggerated with the level of incentives and having to pay zero for the grid, right? So hopefully it was changed. And now I think things are going to get more balanced between utility scale and distributed in the solar.
Yeah, interesting. I do. And again, I've sort of got a sort of one sort of crude metric of sort of the sophistication development of electricity sector institutions is sort of what's being deployed. And at one end of the spectrum is that, if people are doing kind of off-grid diesel generators, that's a bad sign in terms of the worst sign is like the ocean-bound kind of plug into your grid diesel generators that happened in Tasmania a few years ago. That says you probably got things very wrong at some point. And then there's like diesel generators. South Africa this last year, you've seen a boom in distributed solar, but from a security of supply perspective, like I need to keep my lights on. And I think there's like a level above that, which is like distributed solar from a kind of subsidy or uneven playing field perspective. And then I do think you sort of, if you're getting that competing on even level with transmission connected stuff, that's a sign that you're headed in, very crude metric, but a sign that you're headed in the right direction. So I'm always interested to see, where's the capital getting deployed as a metric for how sophisticated a power market is in general. Good. Okay. Interesting. The just one more project finance question on Brazil, and then I want to move on to the final segment of the show. But where do you said you've done a lot of work on the construction risk, commissioning risk, that sort of thing, and that's partly because of history and the state lenders' roles. Where do you see as the biggest risk? Where do you lose sleep at night? Where do you spend your most time in due diligence when you're looking at Brazilian power projects?
So in recent years, John, I think it was a price risk. So we work from the model under the regulated PPAs, 20 years, fully contracted to utility companies, right? That we really didn't have to worry too much about power prices, and it has changed in the last 5 years. So obviously, in most of the transactions, we are taking some price risk. In some of them, for example, even if someone has a very long tenor PPA under the self-production scheme with a big mining or petrochemical company, right? Still, there may be some JPs or basis risk, right? Depending on how the PPAs were structured. And we have seen more and more sophisticated PPAs with different risk allocations between generators and consumers, right? So even on the deals that we have long-term PPAs, there is still some residual important risks in terms of where the energy is being delivered. Is it delivered flat or under seasonality scheme, the hourly prices, and so on. And that's one part of the concern. And the other part is that given that nowadays energy prices are low, right, it is not necessarily good for generators to sign such a long-term PPAs right now, because consumers, they want to pay a very small price that doesn't necessarily make their projects feasible. So what some generators are doing is they are going to merchant strategies with shorter term PPAs. I'm talking about 1, 2, 3, 4 year PPAs, but they still are trying to secure 20-year long financing, right? So we're taking more and more energy risk. So the big question, whether we're going to continue to have these very low prices that we have today forever, or they're going to increase at some point in time, perhaps the pricing risk, either for adjustments or for recontracting energy, is what concerns me the most nowadays.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. And I'm not that surprised. I've been talking with the team quite a lot about, prices are quite depressed right now. Even just price formation in Brazil, in a world in which, power, there used to be a sort of weekly price until quite recently. And to some extent that made sense in Brazil because water is so important. And, the marginal cost of your electricity today might be the opportunity cost of water later in the season. And that doesn't change on an hourly basis. It changes much more slowly than that. And so I think the concept of price formation is becoming more and more relevant, and particularly in a low price environment where people are thinking, what do I need to do to get a project away? What view do I need to have about the future? So obviously, from a modeling perspective, we're delighted to hear that price is rising up the level of risks there. Igor, I think we should bring it to a close soon, but we've got one final segment where essentially I ask you about a set of concepts. And I ask you, for an educated person in the Brazilian power market, is the concept overrated or underrated in general, in your view? So let me start with the first concept, which is the importance of batteries for Brazil over the next 5 years. My own perspective is this couldn't be rated by experts in Brazil lower. There is very little interest in batteries in Brazil in general. Do you think, given that very low bar, do you think they're overrated still, or are they rated even too high, or are they underrated as a concept?
Well, this is a very good question, John, and I have changed my mind over the last years on this a couple times. Sometimes I thought it was overrated, underrated, and right now, I still have in one hand this view that we have the best battery in the world, which is the big hydro reservoirs, and we're going to continue to have that, but they're going to lose relevance as our matrix grow, and we won't have new hydro capacity. So in the meantime, while the hydro still is going to continue to be relevant, I see more batteries application on specific circumstances, some kind of a peak shaving arbitrage of peak hours, and also some grid arbitrage. In some places, the grid fees are so high that it justifies the battery, not for the energy prices, but just for the grid itself, right?
Yeah.
So that's perhaps where maybe we can see more battery investments. And we're going to have a new capacity auction next year, John, that until recently, those capacity auctions, they were always only gas-fired thermal power plants. But now the regulation is changing, and there should be a technology neutrality in a sense that for capacity, it should compete the gas-fired thermal power plants with hydro expansions or hydro repowering, but in addition, also batteries, right? And in that playing field, let's see if battery can get to space. I still don't look that. We still have a lot of hydro repowering capacity and some old gas plants that can be renewed. But for those micro applications of grid arbitrage, we still will see a little bit some.
Okay. So it sounds like if you share my view that the average expert in Brazil thinks batteries roll over the next 5 years is close to zero, then maybe your view is they're slightly underrated by people, and there could be a few more of them. Okay. The next concept is the impact of low energy prices in Brazil on investment right now. And again, for what it's worth, what I hear is prices are very low, terrible time to invest. There's been lots of rain. And so to some extent, the impact of low energy prices on investment is very high. It's big. People think it's the dominant theme right now. Do you think it's overrated or underrated as a concept?
I think it's a little bit overrated.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Not much, because in honesty, it is really, really impacting. I have to be honest. We still see that, but that is combined with other factors, so that's why it's just a little bit overrated. So, for example, even low energy prices is one of the factors. We also have another one very important for investment, which is capex, and capex prices as of now they're still a bit high. For wind, they're high. For solar, they're going down. So I see a little bit more optimism for solar nowadays. I have to be honest. And my friends from the wind sector, please forgive me, but if capex doesn't go down, right, solar is going to continue to have a more relevant play there. And the third important influence factor is also interest rates. And interest rates in Brazil, they have gone a little bit down. They're still at a very high level, I have to be honest. But 1 year ago, the long-term interest rate, they were 100 bips higher than they are today. And there's still room for that to go a little bit lower, right? So at the end of the day, power investments are driven by those three factors. So indeed, low energy prices are not really helping but there are other things that have to be considered. So that's why I think it's a little bit overrated.
Okay, good. And these things can change fast. I've said it before on the podcast. It was sort of, I think people are, the best time to sell a power station is after you've had a really high-priced winter or in Europe or summer in the US. And I do think there is a very strong recency bias in all of these markets. When things are terrible, they're going to be terrible forever. I would, without knowing much about the Brazilian power sector, I would totally agree with you. Good. Final question is sector risk in terms of the regulatory environment, investor perception. We've talked about that. For what it's worth, I think in the sector at least, there's enthusiasm about the quality of the institutions, the efficiency of policy evolution, and those types of things. Do you think the sector risk for Brazil and the power sector is, and I suppose I'm asking sort of from an international investor community to an extent, not necessarily local investor community. Do you think it's overrated or underrated?
I think it's neutral to a little bit underrated maybe, but neutral, because, from a regulatory environment point of view, at least when we put Brazil and compare to our peers, and our most obvious peers in number one are the other countries in Latin America, right? Obviously, other developing economies in the rest of the world, but especially Latin America. At least we have our own problems, right? But at least Brazil, I think, it has been very successful on keeping the trust of investors that the rules of the game, they're not going to change. And if they change, they're going to change for the future and not for the past. So we haven't had any relevant examples of investment decisions that were taken that were ultimately impacted by a changing law or changing regulation that completely destroyed what was invested and what was believed back then, right? Obviously, rules change, but typically we preserve the investments that were made under old rules, right? So that's what I think Brazil is very well positioned when we compare to our peers in this sense.
Okay, great, excellent. Well, that's a good note to finish on. And certainly good for me to hear, given some of the activity Aurora is undertaking in the Brazilian market. It's certainly my experience. So, what a great summary of the sector in general and the lending landscape specifically. So, Igor Fonseca, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us.
No, thank you, John. As I told you before, I'm very excited to see Aurora's investments in the country. It's very good for us to bring a global expert to help us navigating these new times that we have ahead of us, and very good to be invited to this podcast.
That was John Feddersen, founder and chief executive of Aurora, talking to Igor Fonseca, head of power project finance in Brazil for Santander. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.